If you've been following conversations on climate change and climate action, one of the buzzwords that you may have come across is the just transition. On this episode of the Workers Podcast, we'll seek to deepen our understanding of this. I have as our guest, Linne Olsen. She's the Senior Program and Operations Specialist in the Bureau of Workers' Activities in the ILO. Linne, so happy you could join us.
Thank you. I'm also very happy to join you.
Absolutely. Now, I'll start by asking you to sort of give us a brief background and origin of the Just Transition movement.
Yeah, I mean, what is important to point out that the origin of the concept of just transition comes from the trade union movement. And it was actually a little bit more than 30 years ago that Tony Massocci made reference to it. He was a trade union leader at the time of the Oil, Chemical and Atomic Workers Union in the United States. And it was used to counter really the conflict of interest between environmentalists on the one side and trade unions on the other, and particularly also to address the dilemma between environment versus jobs. So Massocci, he argued that workers employed in sectors that were responsible for environmental damages should be supported and also compensated as they transit into new and less hazardous jobs. And he was actually linking the workers' concerns to those of the environmental justice movement. And also important to highlight that at the time there were two elements that were key. Firstly, the need for public responsibility to facilitate and support the transition, but also the need to have a planned transition with a policy, with holistic policy approaches, linking, of course, environmental policies with social policies. And I think these elements are really very crucial also for the understanding of the concept today. So coming back to the early days, I would say, of the concept, I would say that by the late 90s, both US and Canadian unions really had endorsed the concept of just transition. And in 1997, the forerunner of the International Trade Union Confederation, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, as was the name back then, actually included just transition in their statement, trade union statement, to the Kyoto conference. And then we saw between I would say 2010, the concept was more increasingly used by unions into also international climate processes, and that culminated in the Cancun COP 16 conference in 2010, with the inclusion of the concept of the reference to just transition in the final, agreement of that meeting. So that was, how it started, particularly from the trade union movement. I would also like to kind of say a little bit about the ILO involvement, because I think the ILO in the UN has been also at the forefront in making just transition important in the climate agenda. And that also, I would say, culminated in 2015 when we had the tripartite development of the ILO guidelines on just transition, which has become the reference document when we're talking about just transition today. And by that time, 2015, it had become a mainstream narrative at the international level, I would say, with, of course, as you know, the inclusion of the concept in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. And I think that was really the victory for the trade union movement, and the struggle to have workers' recognition in climate action.
Okay, so if you could, quite a bit of information you shared there, but if you could bring it down in a nutshell, what are the key objectives? And then perhaps you could tell us a bit about the progress that we've made on these objectives to this point that we are in history.
Yeah, I mean, the objectives, I think, are still very much linked to the two elements that were important at the beginning in the 90s, and the idea that just transition should not necessarily only be an add-on to climate policies, but really to be an integral part of sustainable development. And from a functional point of view, I would say that just transition has two dimensions, the process and the outcome. And the process is really how we are planning and how we are implementing the move towards a society which is not only green and sustainable friendly, but also a society which provides decent jobs and ensure that we are leaving nobody behind. And of course, this process should involve all those people that will be affected. And particularly, from a workers' perspective, should include workers and their unions. And because this should be a planned process, I tend to say that, it cannot happen from one day to another. It has to be a kind of process that takes some time, even though that we are in urgent need to act when we think of the climate impact. But we cannot close down polluting industries or enterprises from one day to the other. We really have to have fallback alternatives for those workers and those communities that will be affected. So that's for the process. And then, of course, the outcome of that process should be decent work for all and, poverty eradication, because we also want to see not only that jobs are environmental friendly, as I said, but also jobs that provide living wages, that are safe and healthy, and also jobs that are unionized. For instance, we often take the examples of the energy sector. We see that the traditional energy sector with fossil fuel energies, they're traditionally highly unionized sectors. But we also want to see that in the renewable sector, for instance. And this is something that, is important to underscore as well. And I think in short, we could summarize the objectives with the words starting with P, like planning, participation, and poverty eradication. So that's to summarize the objectives, I would think. I think we have the concerns, because you asked, where are we today compared to, 30 years ago? I think the concerns are the same, but I think there are more focus on the need to integrate both social concerns and environmental concerns in more coherent ways. But still, you will find some challenges, and maybe I can take the examples of the nationally determined contribution of the Paris Agreement. Those national plans that each member of the Paris Agreement is developing to address, to say how they're gonna reduce emissions, but also how they're gonna adapt to them. And there, we would advocate for more involvement of unions and more reference to just transition in those NDCs. But still, there is a lot of work to be done. I think by 2021, when the NDCs were updated, 71 parties had included reference to just transition, but only 3% did actually mention social dialogue. So there is a lot of noise, I would say, and the reference to just transition, but when it comes to the original definition and use of the concept, I think there is still, dividing interpretation of it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'll ask you here to just dive in deeper and talk to us a bit more about the importance of the tripartite approach to the just transition, and also a bit more on the role of unions.
role is key for just transition, and that's grounded also in one of the guiding principles for just transition, then namely that we need to have consensus on climate policies. So why do we need to have consensus on climate policies? Well, first of all, I think I could mention like three reasons. It has to do with effective implementation. If we have consensus among the three social part, I mean, with the governments, employers and workers organizations, we would ensure that policies are firstly widely accepted, but also supported. And when everyone agrees, it's easier to implement and also enforce the policies more effectively. So that's really important. And also it creates a more, I would say, stable and predictability environment for long-term planning. And so it would allow for, more informed decision making in terms of consistent policies. And of course, the third element I think is important is the cooperation and commitment, because consensus fosters cooperation across all political, social, and economic lines. And of course, the challenge is, of course, to ensure that tripartite approach. And because to have that, there is one condition which is key, particularly for workers, is that they are allowed to participate. So the fundamental right to freedom of association. Every time when I talk with unions, about being involved in climate change discussions involving policies, I hear their concern about not being heard, of meeting closed doors, deaf ears. So that is pretty frustrating, because unions are proactive and they want to be involved, and they have policies, they have position papers on these issues. But of course, I mean, if you're not allowed to sit at the table, it's difficult to influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, are there any groups of workers or communities that are most likely to be impacted by climate action and climate policy?
Yes. However, I think we're all going to be impacted in some way or the other, directly, of course, by climate effects, but and indirectly by policies to address them. I just wanted to mention one thing. Last year was the warmest on record globally. And we were really on full speed towards the limits of the Paris Agreement, with 1.45 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that, of course, has disastrous impact on workers, particularly those working outside, I would say. One example is the agriculture sector, which is very weather dependent. And the ILO in 2019, we did a research about, impact particularly related to heat stress. And we indicated that as much as more than 99,000 full-time jobs could be lost due to heat stress. This is related to the Caribbean by 2030. And that's, almost 100,000, in 6 years. So, and of course, the biggest part of these are in the agriculture sector, but also construction sector, since this is very weather dependent sectors. Of course, we're not only talking about job losses, but also, working conditions under extreme temperatures. And we see that many health conditions in workers are linked to climate change, like, for instance, cancers. We see that globally, the more than 18,000 workers die from skin cancers every year in relation to their work. So that's just one example. But these are, the direct impacts. The indirect ones related to policies and plans to address climate change. I can mention particularly the energy sector, which is a sector which is often, referred to, phasing out fossil fuel such as coal, oil, and gas, and developing renewable sources will have an impact, of course, on not only workers in those sectors, but whole communities. For instance, when coal mines are closing down in areas where you have little or no alternative jobs, this is not only affecting the workers in the mines, but the whole communities around. So that's why we say that we also have to attach to these just transition policies, industrial policies, to create alternatives in these communities. So we're talking a lot about the negative effects. Of course, it also has some positive opportunities. So I would like also to say, for instance, with the shift towards renewable energies, there might be some opportunities as well, and which could have positive impact on jobs, and currently globally 2.7 million workers are in renewable energy sectors, mainly in the photovoltaic, but the ILO has published a joint report with the international renewable energy agencies with some future prospects, and there are prospects that said that this sector could increase and allow for more than 38 million new jobs. So these are also positive elements, but of course we will have to ensure that those workers that are going to be in those new jobs are equipped to take these new jobs. They are not necessarily those that are made redundant in the fossil fuel energy sector. So, we'll have to see, how we can, for instance, promote education, skills, lifelong learning for those workers to maybe eventually take up those new jobs. So that's also an element which is important to highlight in the transition education.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So now, what can workers do, since we're talking about workers, to ensure that their voices are being heard in this just transition?
The answer to this, I think, is cooperation first. It's integration and use of existing and new fora. With relation to to cooperation, I think it's important also to reaching out to new groups. Of course, partnerships with environmental NGOs can be one avenue, but to increase their voice and be much stronger, but also to reach out to vulnerable groups and to workers in the informal economy, for instance, to get more members. And I would like to highlight an example from Malawi. The Malawi Congress of Trade Unions provide a shorter TVET courses, for instance, for workers in the informal economy, particularly targeting women in the environmental friendly house construction sector. So that's just some examples of what unions can do by reaching out to new groups and have a stronger voice in that sense, but also integration of existing and new policy areas by addressing environment, by addressing climate change and pollution, plastic waste, and all these environmental elements, by using the traditional tools, the traditional trade union tools and approaches is also important. So I mentioned the particular challenge of heat stress and what impact it has on occupational health and safety. We have seen a growing use of collective bargaining by unions to address, challenges related to heat stress. For instance, unions have been able to include in collective bargaining agreements reduction of working time, for instance, during either excessive heat or excessive cold periods during working time, but also compensation for lost working hours and also adaptation of protective equipment. So that's one element. Of course, voice in existing and new fora. A lot of unions are already involved in tripartite structures at national level to influence policies, and of course, using those processes and fora for the climate agenda would be important. I think using the momentum. I was mentioning the nationally determined contribution of Paris Agreement. They were updated in 2020. They will be updated and revised again in 2025. And there is a momentum now for unions to get involved and to be able to influence those NDCs when they're going to be updated in 2025. And this is really the moment for them to, so this is timely, I think, to get involved and increase the only 3% reference to social dialogue in NDCs. And because what we say, there will be no just transition without trade unions, but unions need to be proactive, because nothing comes by itself. But I think that seeing the proactivity of the unions, they're able to make a difference.
Absolutely. Now, if you could, we've talked about so many things relating to the just transition on this occasion, but what are some of the key points as we wind down that workers, unions should remember when contemplating, when thinking of our role in the just transition? If you could reduce it to three or just a few points that we should remember, the key points.
Well, I think that the key point is that you need to be proactive. You need to knock at the door, and to be able to sit at the table and influence. You need to be proactive. That's the first, because you will not be invited unless you are kind of inviting yourself. And of course, to be at the table, you also have to have your own policies and position papers of what you want to kind of have stressed in that at that table, I would say. But for that, of course, it's important that you have the right to participate generally and have freedom of association, and to address that. I think it will also be important for unions to use the tools that we have. We have international labor standards addressing many issues related to that, to the governance issue in relation to freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. We have conventions on that, using the ILO supervisory systems to have that role, but also using the other conventions that we have related to different policy areas that are crucial for a just transition. We have sectoral standards. We have standards related to social protection, to education and skills, and employment, and occupational safety and health. Use all those international labor standards that are adopted and by your respective governments in the climate policy areas.
Excellent. And so what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that there's several mechanisms and opportunities that are available for trade unions and workers to ensure that their voices are essentially heard in this just transition, correct?
Yeah, and maybe I stressed, because the international labor standards are so important, but there are of course also two other tools that I would like to mention. It's the ILO guidelines on just transition from 2015, which is a tripartite agreed document, and which I think constitutes not only a definition of just transition, but also puts the different responsibilities of governments, employers, and workers on what to do to achieve a just transition. So use that tool. It has been endorsed now by the highest decision-making body of the ILO at the International Labour Conference last year. Use that, and last year, we also had resolutions on just transition. We had a general discussion at the International Labour Conference, resolutions to say exactly, to build upon the guidelines, to say what are the responsibilities of governments, employers, and workers' organizations in just transition. And these guidelines and these resolutions are really very, very useful, both in terms of lobbying for participation. If you are denied the right to sit at the table, use these documents, because they are unanimously saying that without social dialogue, without involvement of the social partners, there are no just transition. So use those as both lobby document, but also for the content of the policies that you want to portray in the discussion.
Excellent. Lene, I want to thank you so much for fortifying our understanding of the just transition, and of course, motivating and inspiring more participation on the part of workers and unions as well. Thank you again for being a part of the Workers Podcast right on this edition.
Thank you as well, and good luck to all the trade unions in Antigua and Barbuda with the just transition agenda.
Thank you again. Thank you again. And to our audience, we want to thank you again for being a part of this edition of the Workers Podcast. Do remember, new videos are uploaded on our YouTube channel every Friday. See you next time.